Honored to be your host. I'm very excited about our next guest. Bilal Muhammed is joining us today. So, Bilal, please do join us. Very excited to have you here. Bilal is known as an innovative global and enterprise business transformation subject matter expert. Bilal Muhammed has an extensive pedigree with Fortune 100 and 500 companies in the engineering, risk and regulatory, and business process management space. He has a focus in cultural transformation as the catalyst to sustainable change, and he has proven to be a global champion in this space. Bilal, I'm really thankful for you to be here to share your leadership experience and the journey at Wells Fargo with us. So thank you very much.
No, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and with the audience. And as always, a pleasure, Jose, to be here with you as well. Today, we want to talk about what impacts most of us currently. Moving at the speed of business is typically what we do as a day-by-day BAU operation, but now we're dealing with something that's a little bit more insidious that has had an impact to all of us on some kind of way. So for the next few minutes, I want to share with you kind of the journey of how do we adapt, how do we address the issues in a hybrid environment, but dealing with it now with the reality of a global pandemic. As I said, most of us had been dealing with this fourth industrial revolution, whether it's in the form of AI, whether it's instantaneous information, whether we have our end users or our lines of business now dealing with consumerization, buying their own technology, as it were, and having to find a way to incorporate that within our projects. Also, how do we now move at the speed of business? Now, everyone was really focused on this, and we kind of see on this slide kind of a breakdown of where these industrial revolutions have happened. What we were looking for in our world was what was going to be the tipping point. Was it going to be in education? Would it be in finance? Would it be in politics? What would be the one thing that made us have to instantaneously pivot towards addressing the demand? Well, COVID-19. Out of nowhere, we found ourselves dealing with a global pandemic. We found ourselves having to now adapt to not only telecommuting, but dealing with the impact, societal impact, personal impact, both in a health, educational, political, and social perspective. At the same time, business still has to move forward. How do we address it? Well, that's going to be part of our conversation today. When we're looking, of course, all the conversations around frameworks, around architecture, around information, around data, around all the elements, whether we're using Agile, whether we're using an iterative format, whether we're going to be doing the old school TQM, if it's waterfall, if it's NIST, if it's COVID. What we had to do was to understand that now we were dealing with an end user endpoint disruption model. Well, what does that mean? What that means to us now that we had to deal with platforms, not just products. Prior to the pandemic, we had a pretty stable environment. We knew what the intake was going to be. We knew our consumption models. We had an understood and regulated CapEx and OpEx. We had projects and programs in our pipeline. We had funding. Now we had to deal with something a little bit more. It was the displacement. It was now shifting our data element, which is our primary key, the end user. Now the end user would not be in our buildings, would not be running on our platforms, would not be within the architecture, would be on the other side of the DMZ, would also be in consumer market grade products. We found ourselves now having to deal with SLAs that would be impacted, but we also had to keep our customers satisfied. Even though there was an impact globally, we still had to sustain delivery in an IT supply demand model. So now we had to think a little differently. We had to approach it differently. We had to use another framework. How do we innovate? How do we transform? What I want to discuss with you right now and share with you is something that's a little bit more beyond the scope of our simple approach to technology. It's something that we've kind of forgotten about along the way. And because of COVID-19, we now have been focused and made to focus, on this simple element. How do we drive a personality-driven team, a dynamic personality-driven team? How do we create shared situational awareness? And what do I mean by that? How do we ensure that everyone living now in a very dispersed fashion understand, communicate, and drive to the same end goals, to the same deliverables, working on the same action items, in the same sprints, in the same focus at the same time, while not having the ability to do the informal touch points, to have close proximity, to have to now work not only with the challenges of remote telecommuting, but also dealing with the dynamic that now the home office, school, laboratory, vacation, whatever you want to call the place that you're domiciled. How do we ensure that we still keep this moving forward? Shared situational awareness, communication and collaboration. We're dealing now with platforms, not products, as a strategy. So disruption is an issue now that's on the forefront of all of our minds. What's the clean slate moment? Not that we have a lot of time to adjust. For most of us, it was almost instantaneous. Within about a 10-day period, we went from a normal operational mode to a completely remote workforce. And if there was a mixture within that, we had other people picking up on the work that we've done. So we call this that COVID effect. The COVID effect now is isolating that speed to market governance. We now have to not only address what does a hybrid supply demand model look like, but how do we now overlay it with our current BAU and operational model? How do we take this immediate demand for access to telecommunication, access to remote collaboration tools, access to remote markets, not just offshore and nearshore, but how do we do the B2B interactions? How do we work with our vendors? Now, this is also with the overlying or overarching reality of risk management, risk mitigation, regulatory realities, also maintaining SLAs, OLAs. The efficiencies of a hybrid process, as we know, and I've said in previous seminars, is that now we look at the reduction of key stakeholders, decision makers, and we emphasize on those who deliver and decide as a single function. The ability to now get rid of the noise or the overhead is what we, in the process world, we can call it leaning or whatever we want to do. We just want to get to the brass tacks. Let's just call it that. The previous seminar, I heard my colleague talk about squads and the functionality of being able to say, how do we get to the critical few that can perform the critical task? How do we get to the critical few that can perform the critical tasks? And whether we call them squads, in our world, we call them tiger teams. We also refer to them as centers of excellence. As a resource, we now realize that everything from procurement through implementation all the way to retirement, we had the need to have a contiguous system of record, of workflow, engineering, change, and service management. Those critical elements would be our supply chain. That would fulfill the IT supply demand moment. Also, as an overlay to that, reporting and monitoring. But not just reporting and monitoring from an SLA perspective, but with an enhancement on the risk management and regulatory compliance side of the coin. Because again, for most of us now who are dealing with an expanded platform, we're not only vertical and horizontal, we're now extending beyond our boundaries or beyond our borders. And there are parts of our network we don't control. Because of that, whether it's through VPN, RSA challenges, or however we allow that authorization, access, and authority, we still have to deal with parts of our chain having the ability to be hacked, monitored. And because of that, we have to have a sense of understanding that. So reporting and monitoring becomes very key. When I mention a dynamic team for your leaders and understanding where you have to be to function within this pandemic and still move at the speed of business, you have to develop a single approach of understanding team building with emotional intelligence. When we're in our offices or on our campuses or in our bubble, as it were, for those who understand the sports analogy, when we're in our bubble, it's easy for us to isolate, code switch, and focus on the elements of work. Our work-life balance is very segmented. We understand that this part and these parts don't necessarily meet. In our dynamic today, we have to deal with all of the life and work elements now coexisting in one spot. We also have to deal with the personalities that always are a little different in the office than they are at home. How do we build a dynamic team? How do we address the need to still perform, build our team, understand the human element, understand the work dynamic, and still keep the top performers performing at their best? And how do we take those who are not accustomed to this format and pull them up and move them along the way? Emotional intelligence. Understanding the personalities that you have on your team, subdividing your groups and your meetings into functional elements based upon the personalities. Also, the one-off meetings, virtual water coolers. We have to find a way to be able to still socialize virtually in order to foster and support the functional team dynamic. Because for myself, I'm INTP. The introvert in me doesn't necessarily mean that I cannot interact, but it also means that I may not engage as quickly as others because there's an introspective part. Because of that, in a teaming dynamic in a virtual environment, it may appear to be a little disconnected. So we have to be aware. Some of our most valuable people that have the institutional knowledge are sometimes often the most quiet on phones. They don't engage in a lot of the dialogue because they're already aware of what the issue is. We have to make sure that we understand the personality of our team, because that remote team will function, it will respond, and it will work differently than if we were all in the office face to face, looking at the body language and understanding how to move one another forward. So this is very critical. If we miss this part in a pandemic, we may find ourselves without all the information that is necessary to be able to deliver, to sustain, promote, innovate, and transform. Critical. So what is this mission that I talked about? Creating shared situational awareness, not only in a pandemic, but in our transformation efforts from a process excellence perspective and business transformation. We often miss shared situational awareness. We often miss the feedback loops. We often discount the outliers and the noise as things that detract from the go forward strategy, when in actuality, they're the feedback to the sustainable go forward strategy. Creating shared situational awareness means tearing down the walls between the towers. And we'll talk about different business functional models very quickly, but I want to make sure that everyone understands this point because it is very key. In order for us in this fourth industrial revolution and within our structure of business, in order for us to be able to move and transform and innovate, creating shared situational awareness is key. I refer to it as what is the difference between awareness and illumination. Illumination means that I am pushing information towards you. Illumination means that not only am I making the information aware in a scorecard or in a pipeline report or an executive briefings, I am getting your attention, I am driving this information directly towards you, and I'm putting an analytical understanding behind it so you can interpret what it means to you specifically. You have to engage in shared situational awareness so everyone understands how they participate in innovation and transformation. Often, we drive projects in this very linear, overarching way, even in the agile world. We create stories and sprints that just focus on the key people who are delivering, and everyone else is left out until they're required to participate. But that doesn't give them a continuity of understanding what the deliverable is. So when we look at this, the governance, the visibility, the flexibility, the collaboration, and the control is an ongoing partnership. And it's not just an ongoing partnership within our verticals, it's an ongoing partnership with our end customer all the way back to us. And everyone who participates in that should have that awareness. So this framework of understanding this new demand supply model, how IT should engage in business, how IT supply should interact with the demand, how the the demand should be structured, and what are some of the approaches and the common pitfalls. Now that we've looked at understanding the environment that we have to navigate within a pandemic, now we have to address the parallel issue. The parallel issue is how do we move to this transformation directive. The transformation directive is what we have been doing to this point. But it also means how do we take this directive and how do we take now this dynamic team that is now functioning not only remotely, but is functioning in a very high performing model in a telecommuting format. And now how do we drive this thing forward? Curious question. Structure. The organizational structure is just one element of good governance models. But if you do not have these 5 particular keys in a controlled, high visibility space, you will fail. And it won't be immediate failure. It will be a complacency in the culture. It will be the ability to create tech debt without a care. It will be the ability to not have a service management loop that ties everything from the plan stage and the build stage and the run stage into a continuous monitoring and continuous improvement phase. It will be the ability to stand up projects and deliver it and step away with it without any concern of how it performed. It will be moving into projects without seeing if the projects are still viable or needed. In the 4th industrialized revolution, being able to plan, to have a project or to budget 2 to 3 years down the road does not exist anymore. We have a horizon that's 6 to 8 months. So even if you have things that are fully funded and you're ready to move into this next stop of implementation, you have to now also implement with this new team approach, fewer stakeholders, fewer contributors, very dynamic, very lean, Spartan approach to it. You also have to ask yourself the question, does this project still need to move forward as it has been funded before you do any one thing? So these 5 elements of understanding that the structures are clearly articulated and widely applied. Your leadership mandate is that it is widely accepted, that it is agreed upon and completely understood. Keyword, understood. We just can't have information out there. We have to illuminate. Also, well-defined and consistently followed decision-making processes. We have to have repeatable, reproducible, responsible processes. We have to make sure that as we're doing our work, everyone can get muscle memory to understand what we should be doing so we have a rigor and a cadence. And then we have to have incentive and metrics that are effective to driving that behavior. And then above and beyond everything, going back to understanding your teaming dynamic. An IT staff who is motivated and they possess the desired mindsets and skills. Please understand, those who have been around a long time may not necessarily possess what you need to move forward. As I tell my teams, the things that have gotten you here may not get you there. And we have to understand that. We have to examine it and ensure that we're keeping new eyes, new voices. We have to be both diverse and inclusive in our approach to our mindset of how we do business. Again, this shared situational experience requires us to be able to have new voices, new thoughts, new approaches, new paradigms enter into our conversation as valuable as the legacy information and those who have been doing it for quite some time. The demand supply IT model, nothing new for any of you. You understand we have a business, demand, and supply. I won't get into this because we have a short period of time, but we do have to be able to understand our demand organizations mirror the business structures. We also have to understand that our supply organizations have to focus on delivery, and they organize by capabilities, not the business line. Often we get this confused. Because of that, we find ourselves in different understanding, and we're not able to maximize what we're doing from a process perspective when it comes, in this case, speaking to specifically an IT model. One of the primary things that we have to understand in the supply and demand side of the coin, because as we're trying to transform and innovate, we need to be able to have, again, shared situational awareness. We have to understand what's in the pipeline. We have to understand the overarching realities of the delivery. We have to understand the architecture. What can it support? We have to understand the roadmap to know when our platforms are becoming exhausted, when our products are starting to sunset, when they should be retired. We have Delta Air and other companies that we saw when they ran a platform or product beyond the life cycle, beyond their requisite lifetime. When they failed, it was catastrophic. Up until that point, it worked just fine. So reinvestment in that was not priority. And so companies will sweat assets beyond their prescribed period, only because they're still functional. Doesn't mean that it works, or aligned, but it's functional. So we have to make sure when we're driving innovation, part of the shared situational awareness is understanding the strategy and aligning that strategy to the business demand, and also shaping the business demand while we also look to say, what does the business demand look like? What is that landscape? What is that horizon? When we start looking at that, we can then now start shaping up whether we work in a centralized or decentralized function. I'm going to go back again, understanding how to put together a dynamic team. The dynamic team will help you identify this particular matrix. They will help you identify what you're able to do and how you're able to deliver. This is key. This is critical. This dynamic team, this very sensitive and understood functional body that not necessarily has to work from end to end, but it has to be the foundation that you use to set up and transform. Once you launch it correctly, and then you have some stewardship and governance in a shared situational model, you're able to now scale at ways or unprecedented ways. If you're able to create what I've just shared with you, you will find not only are you able to transform and innovate, but you are also able to accelerate, because now what we're working with is a dynamic team that not only understands the legacy or has embedded within the institutional knowledge, but because of the inclusion and giving and empowering the voice of those who you're including, to have a very diverse and inclusive team with shared situational awareness, you're able to leverage the best of both that's institutional and those things that are transformative. Very key. So how do we engage? Very quickly, it's really just three choices. You're going to have a business-led model where IT and business, and again, in this particular seminar, engages. You're going to have a IT funnel demand through a centralized model, or you're going to have a demand supply model. Those three things are where everything will fall in within functional enterprise businesses. Not spending a lot of time on it, but here are the best things to be able to focus on in regards to the business or BU led. It is geared for innovation because you have no middleman. Understanding that shared situational awareness allows the partnership between the business and IT groups. Challenges, you have to be able to qualify and prioritize your work, because sometimes the business unit with the loudest voice or the most senior leaders will get priority. Doesn't necessarily mean that that's a good or bad thing, but you just have to have the awareness. And for those of us who work in the process management perspective, or project managers or scrum masters, for those who are working in the BPM side of the house, please understand, you have to understand these structures because they will work this way and they will have the challenges of this. So if we look for efficiencies because of maybe we don't want to have that BU led, we can look to say, how do we move towards efficiency? Typically, this becomes that middle period in the transformation. How are we going from where we are today, and how do we get to where we want to go tomorrow? One of the things with a centralized model is that it allows the benefit of scrutiny, introspection, and inspection. And then the business units have a single throat to choke, single tie, or as it were, but also it can have a bottleneck. So we have to be very careful of that. And then for responsiveness, the best and overall piece of this is that you have this demand supply model. It allows you to be able to set up for yourself an interface on demand. It also has the challenges, if you're not aware, is that you can become an order taker, so things can pile up in the queue. So we have to be very careful of that as well. Move very quickly with this because time is on us. When we're looking at the three choices, typically life cycle model comes in, plan, build, run, or PBR. When we look at the PBR model, we find ourselves looking at the benefits of technical skills or interactions, and again, going to that shared experience works better. There is a consistency in the SDLC model. There's a consistency in the build, and from an adaptable perspective, it also allows you to say, how do we move in an agile perspective? It mirrors and matches and aligns to it very, very quickly. The one thing I want to caution us, as we're kind of getting near the end of our time frame, there's more to say, but I think this is very clear that we want to focus on. These 5 elements apply across all of the models, across all the platforms, across all the businesses. It's not IT. This is dealing very strictly with business. If you're looking at problems, if you can put them in one of these 5 buckets, you can now start driving and innovate and make things better. As we're in a pandemic, all of these things are now amplifying, magnitudes of 10 or more. As you develop your teams, as you look at your approaches to your models of implementation, as you identify your frameworks, as you start rolling out different products in the midst of this pandemic, as we start looking at how do we maximize a remote workforce, we have to remember these pitfalls, because these will be the things that will plague us as we move forward. I won't spend a lot of time talking about the transformation because we've had that. We did focus really though on the acumen. We talked about tiger teams, having culturally sensitive centers of excellence. And now this new time market will allow us to innovate and deploy rapidly with illumination. Illumination means that we're pushing this information out towards with a qualification. Also now, introspection becomes part of the dynamic of the team, not just inspection. And so now we're learning from our data, we're becoming better at what we do. And every cycle that we do, we're now driving. How do we realize this framework, this transformational directive? You now have better agile awareness. You are controlling and driving the consumer journey, and you have partnered dashboards and scorecards that are now comprehensive. It allows us to focus on what we're doing. So regardless of the terminology that you use, transformation, disruption, innovation, it is very crucial that you understand what we've just talked about. The extent of the digital transformation has an effect across the organizations beyond what we see today. We also have to ask the question, what do people expect from their efforts at transformation? We have to control the journey. We have to speak to the journey, and we have to illuminate it every step of the way. How do we measure the success of their actions? How do we give immediate feedback to immediate work? Not only just fail fast, fail often, but how do we award immediately? How do we applaud and support and drive the teams in a positive way that gives them positive feedback, even if the positive feedback is challenging? And more importantly, is technology growing to become more important than the people in the organization? The fourth industrialized revolution brings technology into us in such a way that it can be overwhelming. We have to remember, as we build teams, as we build structure, as we transform and as we innovate, people are the final step, the final element in our transformation. We are empowering people to do better, stronger, faster. I think that's it for today. And I will just leave you with this thought. We're dealing with accepting a challenge, not only from COVID and a pandemic, but how do we still push the needle? How do we still transform? How do we still innovate? Thank you for your time. I do appreciate it. And we'll look for questions now.
Terrific, Bilal. Thank you so much for sharing that. We have a number of questions that have come up here. I'm going to ask you to stop sharing your presentation so they can see your picture of the video a little bit bigger. No, bring your video back on. Just click the stop sharing the presentation on the GoToWebinar interface. There you go. Excellent. Thank you so much for that. So we had several questions that came up as you're speaking, and I encourage our audience to continue the questions, and I'll keep monitoring as we go through the live Q&A here. The very first question, let me bring this up here, had to do about the assessment of the personalities in your team, if you will. And before I ask you that question, let me understand the team context a little bit better. What size of team you're talking about here? What are the main objectives in the organization? And maybe that, if you can provide some context on the team.
Yeah, sure. Typically in our teams, we're organized across a lot of verticals, everywhere from legal to engineering, to procurement, vendor management, vendor relations, our end users, our business units. So we have a very cross-pollinated matrixed environment, and we deal with not only a lot of focus, but we deal with a lot of individuals that have a different approach to business as well.
Very good, very good. How many people roughly you're talking about?
Depends on implementation. Some of our teams are as small as 10 to 15. We have teams that go into 40, 50, 60. So it just depends on the particular project and that particular sprint or that particular program.
Excellent. So, so the first question comes from Mustafa Koriba here. Mustafa has a bit of commentary. He says the Myers-Briggs are good at understanding personality traits and how to relate to people. He has found that Belbin is more appropriate for selecting team members, and his curiosity is really about that. It's have have you considered other team tools on this journey of identifying the personality types? Have you really focused on using Myers-Briggs for that? If you can share a little bit more about that.
Yeah, Mustafa, that's actually a very great question. I in no way am promoting one above the other. What I am promoting is that we have to do something, right? So the question becomes, what tool? Now, again, if you have one that you prefer or if you don't have one, I want to make sure that we have a starting point and acknowledge the ability to drive innovation, but not only drive innovation, how do we work as a community within our own companies is understanding everyone who's at the table. We get the best out of our teams when we understand how to communicate with them, and also what's the best way to engage them to get the most out of them. So that really is the focus. Whatever tool that you use, and if you don't know, for those who are on the phone who don't understand what these are, then I would say go to your HR reps and work with them. Typically, they have those tools or they have references or access to that, and bring them into your teams so you can have a good. As a manager, I've always employed some form of that so that I could be able to better understand my teams, so that I could better not only manage but partner with them to ensure that I'm getting the best out of them. So potentially we have phenomenal teams. But if we potentially have phenomenal teams, that means that we're not getting the best out of them. So again, Mustafa, great question. And again, I would just challenge all of those who are listening to implement that in part of your team forming. If you don't, you're going to be missing some of the best information and the best resource elements that you have.
Excellent. Jonathan Glenny has another follow-up question here. He says, after understanding the environment, did Wells Fargo look at the concept of duality? And he talks about duality as the separation of core processes and improvement to those core processes, and separating that from new digital growth. And his additional commentary is that I'm referencing the ability for legacy organizations to migrate data sets for certain core processes to the cloud, and using that to work on, say, transforming the revenue cycle, and from another perspective, working to develop new digital improvements. So it's a bit about the core and about sustaining the core and extending and growing the business. He's curious about how those concepts are evolving there at Wells Fargo.
Yeah, so I would say, because that's a lot, right? I would say I wouldn't necessarily put it specifically on Wells Fargo. I would just tell you that for every company that exists on legacy content, but either through merger and acquisition or just through innovation and transformation, you do have to find a way to not only continue running on your existing platforms, but now how do you introduce? Because the question becomes not replacement, it becomes introduction. And while one thing is sunsetting, another starts to sunrise, and you have to maintain certain levels of business. Now, I would say across the spectrum, not just for Wells Fargo, but across the spectrum. What we understand is, because we have to maintain the business, we have to maintain the operational sustainability and moving that forward, we do also have to introduce how do we introduce without disrupting, but at the same time replacing the platforms. And what you have, and you mentioned it very well, a lot of companies are now moving into the cloud space, whether it's an internal, like external. A lot of people are using Amazon Web Service, AWS. Some people are using companies that directly allow them to outsource part of their platform. But that ability to now take the growth into a very dynamic and flexible environment allows for not only the introduction of new products, but it controls the OpEx side of the coin. So if we're controlling that, that allows us to now introduce and innovate new platforms of service. So you're able to pilot more programs. For those of us who have been around in the technology space, in the fintech space, we all remember everyone had a banker, and you had a personal relationship with that banker, and you knew that banker's name. and you went to that banker with a piece of paper and you had a transaction. Now, rarely do we go to the physical bank and interact with an actual banker. It's online, or it's an ATM, or there are other different ways. How did that happen? That displacement came about understanding what your core business and the business strategy is, and introducing technology that not only mirrored, but it enhanced services. That enhancement was actually a replacement and disruption, but it was introduced in a way that it complemented services. So as we're dealing with our legacy technology, we complement the services and we move, for example, traditional voice services and now VoIP. VoIP introduces the ability to have digital transformation. Digital transformation now links data to the voice. Now I can take my profile of my customer, and now when the phone rings, not only do I see their name and number, but their account information and everything comes up, and also the opportunities to upsell. All happens simultaneously, but from an end customer, it's still a very seamless journey. So that begin again, and as I talked about again, understanding the end customer as your end data point. If we factor to that, everything behind that can be transformation, and it's seamless and it's fairly transparent. But that's a great question. Thank you very much for asking.
Very good. Bilal, Hervé da Costa, who is coming in from the southern portion of France today, first said, very informative. Thank you for sharing this session. And he's curious about whether you have some examples where the agile approaches are actually not enough, or the agile approaches are limited for transformation, for innovation acceleration. So in summary, is agile always the solution, or there are places where agile isn't really the right approach?
Yeah, no, a great question. Merci beaucoup. But thank you very much for asking. I think, again, it kind of goes back into the last part of the presentation. We have to understand our structures, sometimes because of SLAs, often because of vendors and third party. Vendors and third party will have a direct impact on an agile engagement. Often their SLAs will not mirror or match what we need. Also in innovation, sometimes the SDLC cycle, as we start to do the design work and the development, those cycles may be a bit elongated. So we have to account for those. It influences the sprints. So when we're dealing with development, when we're dealing with third party, when we're dealing with vendors, those things will have an immediate impact on what we look at sprints and how they should, because people unfortunately associate agile with agility, and it's not synonymous. But in business, we find ourselves sometimes thinking, oh, it's agile, which means it should be done in a day. And it's not. So we have to make sure we control the narrative. As you're putting together your book of work from an agile perspective, as you're designing that story, you have to communicate to your stakeholders things like vendor engagement, things like third party, things like development cycles, understanding that. A lot of what we've done is in our agile side of the house, we've taken our JIRA team and we've moved JIRA and agile closer, because we understand that what's going to be happening in that workflow will be the least of what we can do. It will have the most impact. And because of that workflow, it will influence what we can do here. Controlling the narrative, I think, is the most important part of agile. Not necessarily that we're looking for acceleration, but we're looking at what's the discernible parts that we can control in a certain frequency at a certain cadence. But a great question, because I think a lot of our leaders have adopted agile as a philosophy for acceleration, and not for having something that is consistent, constant, concise, and something that allows us to not have an 18-month project that we don't discover the end state until 18 months later. So a very good question. And again, I think those three elements are the pieces that really influence how effective or efficient from a perspective Agile can be.
Irvi is sending you a merci beaucoup here from that answer. So thank you very much. We also have Jonathan Glenny say thank you, thumbs up. Coach Paul DeCanson saying that what a great approach with your teams and accelerating technology and innovation. And Bilal, thank you so much for taking the time to go into the depths of the journey that you're going through and the improvements and innovations that are being implemented. We appreciate your leadership and appreciate your insights very much.
No, thank you for having me, and thank you all. Stay safe. Take care.
Thank you. All right, ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our third session of the day, and we're going to wrap up the conference and the last session of the day at the top of the hour with a tremendous speaker coming directly from Europe, the leader for improvement and innovation at Lego. Peter Evans is going to be with us. So you do not want to miss Peter. Join us at the top of the hour to have a great conversation on how one of the most innovative the organizations in the world is dealing with changes in culture, in business, and digital transformation. So look forward to seeing you at the top of the hour with Peter Evans and Lego directly from Europe. Thank you.